Welcome to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Established in 2016, the Fintech Times is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading fintech newspaper. We report on the latest and brightest ideas from the fintech world. Follow the conversation using hashtag TFD News and Views and follow us at the Fintech Times. Hello, and welcome back to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. I am here as always with the wonderful Tom and Francis. How are you guys doing this week? Tom, how's life?
Hello, life is good. I'm glad to be back on the podcast. I'm just enjoying life at the moment. It's been quite a semi-busy week with news coming in. So and we've got some interesting stories and things to talk about today.
Amazing stuff. Love that. Francis, how are you doing?
I am very well. Echoing really what Tom said. It's been a relatively busy week, but I think I'm really happy with the variety of stories we've got today, and I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation. How about you, Polly? How are you?
You know what? I was just thinking that no one ever asks me how I'm doing. So thank you, Francis. It's like you've read my mind. I'm doing all right. It's a bit miserable today, weather-wise, but otherwise, all good. Like you say, what a day to be talking about fintech. But what are you guys going to be talking about this week? What stories are you bringing to the table? Francis?
So with Financial Inclusion Week starting next week, as of recording yesterday, I reached out to the fintech industry to find out what fintechs are doing to actually be financially inclusive. So we're going to be discussing that.
Awesome. And Tom, how about yourself?
So earlier this week, a new payments manifesto was released by the Payments Association in the build-up to the next general election in the UK. So I'm going to be talking about that.
Awesome. And then I'm going to be looking at funding trends in Southeast Asia small businesses. So a very big variety today of different stories. But Francis, why don't you go first with your financial inclusion piece?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned just now, I guess, next week will be Financial Inclusion Week. And with that in mind, I thought we always hear about this, and especially on the podcast, we always talk about it. You know, what organizations are actually doing to be financially inclusive. How are they changing their programs? How are they changing their culture? And just in general, really, how fintechs have really opened the doors to access to finance that many people previously didn't have access to. So with that in mind, I reached out to a bunch of different organizations and different fintechs, and I really had an overwhelming response. It was really good to see, and it was very difficult to decide which organizations to really feature in the article because like I said, we had, I think, nearly 40 responses, and they were all really, really valid, and it was a really difficult decision. But what I ended up doing was to show that there isn't really one region leading the way with financial inclusion, and there isn't really one region that needs financial inclusion more than anyone else. That might be a little bit controversial, but I think when you think about it, really, no matter what country you're looking at, there's going to be people that have been excluded from traditional finance. And it's really interesting to see how different fintechs have really decided to tackle this. So in the US, for example, we heard from Moneyline how it was really creating a more accessible market, and that especially since the pandemic, some people really struggled to have access to finance. And it was just a really interesting way to sort of see how the company was promoting financial literacy. And that's something that we've spoken about on the podcast many times, of making sure people are educated in the right way and understand finances. So I thought that was really interesting. And then we go over to Asia, where we spoke to the head in the Philippines of Salmon, the POS lending fintech. And he explained how the company is making credit accessible for individuals who until now were locked out of the traditional banking system in the Philippines. So that also was really interesting, learning about sort of QR payment options and how it's using facial recognition to help identify customers, especially when there's 26 different types of accepted forms of identification in the Philippines. So there was a lot of different, and again, this is only talking about a brief few. We also looked at MoneyPoint in Nigeria and Finfra in Indonesia and MyTU in Europe. There was a really nice range of fintechs. But what I wanted to discuss with you guys really is, have there been any fintechs, in your opinion, that have really stood out to you? Because in my opinion, one fintech that has really sort of stuck with me ever since I interviewed them was Redivi, this Costa Rican pay tech. And what it did really was it acknowledged how many people have access to WhatsApp in the country. And what it did, it was that it layered a payment layer essentially over WhatsApp, meaning that people could make payments without necessarily needing, these historical and traditional, say, banking features. And I thought that was something that was really interesting, that, you know, when you think about access to finance, it's banks, right? That is what you think of. You think of bank accounts, and you think of how difficult it is for some people to get bank accounts, and then they're just left in this limbo. So I think when you find a fintech that's really sort of trying to break that status quo and really be more inclusive, I think it's a great thing. So yeah, Tom, I'll come to you first. What fintech has really stood out to you?
So a few actually came to mind when I was thinking about, fintechs that are really driving financial inclusion, especially sort of card related offerings. And one of the ones that I was thinking about was a New York based fintech called Petal. And that's basically uses consumers' bank data in the US to determine their credit worthiness. So essentially, it recognized that a lot of consumers in the US are being turned away from banking offerings, because their credit scores aren't good enough. And what it actually does, instead of just looking at credit scores, it looks at your banking history, and it looks at your banking data for as long as they can access, and determines whether you might have been making repayments to something else, a loan or something, in the last few years, and you've never missed a payment. But because your credit score is too low, you're not allowed to take out another loan or another service or whatever that may be. And I thought that was just a nice way to make the offerings that banks and fintechs have a little bit more inclusive, as it sort of takes this data that is available, and tries to look past this kind of aged system, really, of credit scores.
Yeah, definitely. And I always like when we hear about a fintech that's really challenging credit scores and really trying to. I mean, I can't think of any off the top of my head, like their names, but I know that we've definitely covered a lot of them. And they'll be for migrants who have moved country and they can't bring their credit score from their previous country with them. And I think that is one of the biggest things that fintechs have really done, is really help bring that credit history over, which then helps families and people set up in new countries. I just also want to correct myself, because I realized I made a mistake with Redivi, in that I said it was an alternative to banking or traditional banking. What it actually does was an alternative to cash, and helps people send money from abroad, and helps the remittance market. And I think that is what I don't know, I think I must have got it confused with a different company. But what it does is essentially helps families or people abroad send money back over to families that have previously struggled to get finances and really establish themselves. And I think it's always just been one fintech that stuck out to me. But anyway, sorry, Polly, we'll go to you this time.
No, I think this is a really interesting topic, Francis. So thank you for bringing this to the table today. And in terms of like a company that I think is doing some really cool stuff for inclusion that has really stuck out to me, was Sibstar. So I actually interviewed the founder, Jane Sibley, back at Pay 360 in April of this year, I think, just to talk about her product. And it's, like you say, it's just something that's really kind of stuck with me as to doing a really cool thing. So essentially, Sibstar is a money management app to help people with dementia to sort of manage their finances but stay independent. So the backstory was that both of her parents, if I'm remembering rightly, I should have watched my interview before I started talking about this, but both of her parents struggled with dementia, and they would kind of spend their money on sort of anything, you know what I mean? Like one example she gave was her mum would buy everyone's nails at the nail bar, or she'd just take a load of cash out and things like that. And it was getting to the point when it was getting to be a problem. All the money that they'd saved, over the course of their lives, was kind of just being wasted. So she wanted to come up with a solution, and this is kind of what she came up with. So a debit card, an app designed to help people living with dementia and their families to safely manage their everyday spending while still giving the sense of independence to people with dementia, to kind of, hold on to that sort of thing. And I just think it is really cool. And, obviously I talk a lot about fintech and niches and stuff, and this is exactly where that comes into play. So you can get the debit card, and it kind of works pretty much similarly to any sort of debit card or like bank account or savings account kind of thing. But that there's two people kind of looking after it in the account. And I think it's really great because obviously everyone should have access to financial services in a way that works for them. And just because someone has an illness such as dementia, which, can diminish mental faculties and make it difficult to sort of operate in the outside world, having a financial solution that means you can still manage your finances, but just with some oversight to keep that independence that you have and to keep that financial security as well, I think is brilliant. So kind of a little bit different to some of the ones you guys mentioned, but one I think is really important, and I hope carries on, really. I mean, we spoke last week about the like over 50s savings platforms, and I think things like this for dementia, Alzheimer's, and other sort of conditions that might affect your mental capacity might be a good idea to see more financial inclusion-based products coming out around that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think when we're talking about financial inclusion, I think it's very easy to go to, the unbanked and people who don't have traditional access to finance. But I think you're absolutely right, Polly, in identifying a company that is helping in developed countries that people do have access to finance, but instead it's helping niche groups. And I think that's something that we've agreed upon before, and I think it really does speak volumes to fintech's use, and that is it's helping niche groups. It is identifying certain group or certain people or anyone really that needs help, and it's helping them get access to finance and making sure that they are being financially responsible. And yeah, no, I think those are great examples. So thank you both for bringing those to the table. Why don't we go to Tom? Why don't we go to you next?
Absolutely. So, as I said at the start, recently the Payments Association released a new payments manifesto, because we're now hitting a time where talk about an upcoming general election has started, whenever that may end up actually being, and the political gears have started turning. This week we've seen Keir Starmer get covered in glitter at the Labour conference. So that's how you know the political sort of news roll has really started to heat up. But basically, just prior to that, the Payments Association explained that they want to try and make and ensure that the UK payments industry can lead the world in providing innovative solutions. And they put together this manifesto covering all aspects of the industry in the hopes that the main political parties will incorporate some of their suggestions into their own manifestos when they reveal them. And basically, the manifesto prioritizes the likes of tackling weaknesses that enable criminals to commit fraud, such as authorized push payment fraud scams, which it says is a £485 million issue for the industry to solve. The manifesto also explains that it wants the UK to strike a balance between fostering innovation, encouraging competition, and protecting consumers. And sort of as a result of that, it's urging the government to hold the FCA to account for providing high standards and consistent supervision of electronic money institutions and payment institutions. And it basically believes that the FCA should invest in the absolute best staff and resources possible to provide a more effective authorization system for these institutions applying for licenses. And finally, it also believes that the next party in control should be actively promoting the adoption of account to account payments by supporting the work already done by the Joint Regulatory Oversight Body, or JROC, to create a competitive and sustainable open banking ecosystem that's going to deliver alternative payment options for merchants. And finally, they're talking about really promoting digital currencies, which it believes is going to be the future, or at least make up a significant part of the payments ecosystem in the future. And it believes that whatever party gains control of the country next should really be prioritizing that as well. So basically, on the back of that, I was wondering what each of your takes was on this. Do you think manifestos should be, or this type of manifesto looking at payments, should be prioritizing any other areas? Or, which of the areas is it already covering, do you think is really, really important for the next, say, 4 or 5 years? Francis, I'll come to you first.
I think it's really interesting that just talking about digital currencies and their adoption, really, because I don't know, I know we've mentioned it on the podcast before, but I always feel like digital currencies and digital assets have sort of fallen by the wayside a little bit now. I don't know if it was just the hype following the pandemic and sort of lockdown, and everyone was sort of really getting into the digital world. And since then, things have sort of just slowed down a little bit. But I do find it really interesting and quite encouraging as well that, there is still this desire to really promote digital currencies and really say this is what we believe the future of payments to be. I remember when I did a book review, I think it was last year, and it was really discussing about how the financial market has evolved over the years, and it was discussing the reasons why cryptocurrencies and sort of digital currencies perhaps haven't been as widely adopted at the minute, and that's just because there's people aren't used to it. And I remember the sort of the I can't remember the exact sentence, but it was along the lines of today's mysteries are like tomorrow's certainties or something like that. And basically what it was just trying to say was that what people aren't sure about in this generation, the next generation are going to see as the status quo. And I think that's a really interesting take. And I think this is an interesting development in really working towards making digital currencies the new norm. So I think it will be definitely interesting to see if this actually happens. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just a recommendation. But I mean, at the end of the day, it'll be difficult to see the impact because people don't know how beneficial these can be. So it really comes down to the parties really explaining it properly. But I think it's got potential, and I think it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the concept of CBDCs has been something that I've always been quite skeptical about, but it's something that the UK government has already started to. It's already started the consultation phase and things like that, and I think the kind of right people are thinking about it to realistically think it will be a thing in the future in the UK, unless there's a drastic U-turn on the sort of development of it. But it's something that's being looked at across so many countries across the globe, of all levels of development, really. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the next few years, especially, bring in terms of this, and whether maybe the UK will try and be one of the leaders in bringing this kind of digital currency to the forefront. But Polly, what about you? Do you think that there's anything that hasn't been covered that maybe should be covered when it comes to payments, or is there a part that you think is specifically important?
I kind of echo what you and Francis have already said. I will say I really quite like the quote from Tony Craddock, who is the Director General of the Payments Association, that says, "Money has always evolved through time. It's an unstoppable historical process." And I think that's really true, and I think you can say that for a lot of things. Everyone always hates change. The idea of we've always done it that way is almost one of the most dangerous, right? Because it means that you're holding back development. And I think he's kind of hit the nail on the head here, in that things have always evolved. It's whether you want to actually kind of like get on board and accept their evolution, and particularly with these new technologies, obviously digital currencies, like you guys have already talked about. It's really interesting to see the I guess the strong views to both for and against these systems, and it's interesting to see how that kind of like plays out within society, because I mean payments are one of the most important things, right? And that might be just a gross oversimplification, but so much of the world is run via payments, whether it's you buying your food for the day, or whether it's like big companies making payments to insure their products or anything like that. Payments are such an essential part of the economy, both in the UK and worldwide, that you can see why there's sort of so much fuss about them, I guess, for want of a better word. And I think this manifesto is really interesting. I think it talks about a lot of different things that are really important. I think the commitment to fighting fraud and other crime is obviously something that's going to continue to be a trending topic, I guess, but I don't know if you can even call it trending when it's just something that's always in the background, always happening, and holding the FCA to high standards in order to sort of help tackle these issues, I think it is really important. Digital currencies and account-to-account payments, also very similar. I guess it depends on your view as to whether you think digital currencies are going to be the future of the economy, and I think a lot of people aren't necessarily sure about that yet, and whether it is going to be something like a CBDC or other crypto. I think people still can't make their minds up as to what direction it's going to go in. So I guess it's very interesting to see the manifesto set out such a clear vision for a digital currency ecosystem in a future where everything's going to be digital and everything's going to be technologically based. And whether, I guess, people are going to get on board with that, or whether it's even going to go in a completely different direction. Maybe something else will happen that we don't even know about yet, and is just going to tick along and eventually become the thing with payments. So I think it's a really interesting space to be in, and it's a really interesting space to look into, because it's something as so in sort of a payment in theory is very simple. It's just you give someone money and then you get back whatever it is that you are going to get back, whether that's a service, a product, or whatever. So on the face of it, a payment is very simple, but actually underneath it, it's so unbelievably complicated. So it'll be really interesting to see how that all plays out, and whether kind of this manifesto kind of goes along with what's going to actually happen in the economy.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that it really touched on is it wants to ensure that the UK remains as a leader in terms of innovation. And what that means, we already the UK has already been proved itself to be a leader. When you think about open banking, how far that's come, and obviously there's still arguably a long way to go for that, but it's something that it has led the way in. And as you say, if any country is going to be surprised by a development, particularly when it comes to payments, it might actually be the UK that sort of brings out something unexpected and runs with it. So I think it's an exciting place to be, and hopefully if the likes of the FCA are held to account to a high standard, then might put us in a good place for the future. But I guess we'll go to your final article now, last but not least.
Yeah, for sure. A slight shift in focus, but only slightly. So essentially, this article is about how 70% of SMEs in Southeast Asia started with personal savings and other sort of funding key trends within Asia. So essentially, funding societies surveyed 977 SMEs in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam to find out kind of what their funding situation was like, essentially. And the findings suggest that Southeast Asia's economy is on the road to recovery after setbacks caused by the pandemic. And there was a lot of different trends in the report as it looked into the behaviours and challenges SMEs are facing, and how using digital financing and payments can capture business opportunities and efficiencies. So some of the sort of key trends that were seen in this report was that bank transfers remain the most popular payment method for SMEs, with nearly 90% paying their suppliers and 88% receiving payments from customers through bank transfers. But not all SMEs have forgotten about cash, with 51% of respondents from Indonesia revealing that they pay suppliers and receive payments from customers in cash, with the similar story in Malaysia, with 63% still receiving payments from their customers in cash. And a lot of the SMEs that were surveyed were more concerned about payables, particularly their capacity to pay suppliers, with more than a third of respondents listed accessing to financing, including loans and credit cards, and fulfilling payments as their top payable issue. And across the region, respondents said their biggest expenses were for daily operations and inventory and supplies. So I thought this was a really interesting look into kind of the challenges that represent SMEs, small and medium enterprises in Southeast Asia, and sort of how businesses are running over there economically. And it's very interesting to see how, despite the current situation, the region does appear to be a lot less impacted when you compare it to the other parts of the world. And with the economy on the road to recovery, there's certainly a lot of innovative solutions for SMEs, both by traditional and digital financial companies, to choose from. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the ease of accessing different financial solutions or other products. So I'd love to know what you guys think. Southeast Asia, what are your thoughts on the economy over there? Are things looking good for SMEs, or is it still a bit dicey? Tom, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I think the kind of opening line of this article was that 70%, as you said, of SMEs started their business with seed money raised from their personal savings and from financial support from family and friends. And I thought that was quite alarming, really. 70% is such a massive proportion. And for the region, you think about some of the countries in that region, they aren't the most prosperous across the globe, and in a push to kind of what's the word, try and really drive their economies further and grow their economies. I was surprised at how little support SMEs were receiving in the region from banks and the government in the region. 70% starting that with their own money without traditional bank supporting them or alternative financing options. I think it's interesting to see that actually, while good things have been happening and the economy actually has perhaps outperformed what people expected it to in the region, it's an interesting time and showed that perhaps more could be done to support SMEs and to, one, grow them, but two, help people found new small, medium-sized enterprises in the region, which in turn could prove massively helpful for the economy in the region. So I think that stat alone showed there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you there. And I think it's interesting when you look at sort of the funding, like you're saying, and how, I guess there's a lot of opportunity here for fintechs to come in and kind of, swipe some of the financing solutions that banks aren't really taking advantage of. But Francis, what do you think?
One of the stats that really stood out to me was the fact that bank transfer remains the most popular payment method for SMEs. And I feel like a lot of the time fintechs sort of have come in to really replace bank transfers and act as alternative payment methods. And I think the fact that so many people are using these digital transfers shows that they're digitally aware and that they are using these new payment features. I mean, sure, cash is still readily available and readily used, but I did find it really, really interesting that many people are using bank transfers, both for customers and SMEs. I think when we're looking at the stats, really, I think what's interesting is how it's going to change in the future. I think the entire region is probably going to be very digitally focused, and I think the innovations that we're seeing are really going to be adopted quickly when you think about how digitally conscious people already are and how they're already using the technology available to them. So I think it's really good early signs, and I think digital adoption will be really strong.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a really good time, obviously, in Southeast Asia, and with everything kind of recovering and getting back to it. Hopefully, it's going to be looking good for the SMEs in the region, especially with their digital financing opportunities available to them. But that does bring us to the end of our discussion today. Thank you so much, guys, for bringing the stories along. If you want to hear any more about what we've talked about today, or anything else from the fintech world, head on over to fintechtimes.com, where you can read plenty more news and insights on there. But let's move on to what I learned this week. So each week we learn loads of new information. Being in the Fintech Times editorial team, so much stuff crosses our desks that we thought it would be fun to share that with our listeners. So Francis, what have you learned this week?
Cheers, Polly. So this week I learnt that Exola has introduced new payment personalization methods to gamers called headless checkout, and this follows the fact that PayPal, according to Statista, was the most popular payment method used by gamers in 2018, and it's just interesting to see how times have changed.
Awesome, love that. And Tom, what have you learned this week?
This week, in keeping with the theme of my article, I learned that Labour have proposed to put more financial numeracy into primary schools, which kind of goes off the back of what we were talking about I think either 2 or 3 weeks ago about the need for more financial education for young people in the UK in schools. And I thought that was just a solid proposal based on what we've been speaking about recently.
Awesome. And then what I've learned this week is coming from our Women in FinTech focus at the Fintech Times, and how important mentorship is to helping advance women in FinTech. Something I think we all knew anyway, but I think it's interesting. We've got some really great comments from a few different FinTech leaders about how sponsorship is also a lot more important as well. Especially when you're trying to advance in your career as a woman. So very interesting stuff. I think you should definitely head on over and give that a read. A shameless plug there. But thank you so much, guys, for joining me this week. It has been a pleasure to talk about fintech with you. And I'll catch you on the next one.
See you guys next week.
See you then.
Thanks for listening to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Don't miss next week's episode and continue the conversation using hashtag TFT News and Views and follow us at the Fintech Times.